to ask the city council to come up. I'd like to introduce them as well. Oh, yeah, what the heck? Oh, there they are. So to your left, David Cook, in the middle, Rachel Hundley, and then to the far left, your right, Amy Harrington. And of course, I'm Madeline Agramonte. So I'm just very happy to see you all here, and I think this is such a great subject, and I think we're all happy. We're all excited about hearing what everybody feels. Thank you, and that's it. You won't hear from us anymore.
Good evening. I'm Kathy Capriel. I'm the city manager, and also like to extend my welcome and thanks to the Community Center for hosting us here tonight. What I'd like to do is tell you a little bit about what we're going to do. A few logistics. One, please silence those pesky cell phones if you would. And I'd also like to introduce kind of the team that's going to be presenting some of the information tonight. So to my immediate left and your right is Jeff Collin. Jeff is with Muni Services. Muni Services is our sales tax advisors, and they have developed an expertise in cannabis and are helping cities across the state look into these areas. And so we're pleased to have their input and expertise and kind of just perspective since they're looking at a number of communities on these issues. Fran Mancina is also with Muni Services, and so the two of them will be doing a majority of the presentation. And then David Goodison, our planning director as well. I'd like to acknowledge John Abachi, who's one of our assistant city attorneys, is here as well in case we get into any of those specific questions. So maybe just briefly, how did we get here? As you all know, Canada's law and regulation and voter initiatives have shaped where we are today. The council had a number of conversations in 2017 and actually put in place some current moratorium in order to allow the community to have these kind of conversations and decide where we wanted to go. So the direction at the end of last year was to do community outreach. This is part of that outreach. And then be prepared to come back and talk in May where we can get policy direction from the city council. There are three areas that the council wanted us to explore. One was testing, one was manufacturing, and the other was medicinal dispensary. So those are the three areas that they asked us to explore. There are a number of cannabis licenses that the state allows, and we'll give you that broader picture as well as we move forward. So with that, I will turn it to Jeff Collin. We will do a presentation. David has a map that also is a handout. If you don't have the handouts, please grab, there's an agenda, a map, and some research information that was on the front table. So that might be helpful to refer to. Once we get through some of the presentations, then we will do Q&A based on the size of the group. I think we'll just go ahead and ask people to come up and use the microphone when we get to that point, ask a question. The first part really will be questions, not comments. So if there's any information that isn't clear or additional information folks want, we'll then kind of take a break and let people do some exercises. So, and Jeff Collin will explain this when we get to that point, but looking for some feedback and want to make sure not everyone's comfortable coming up and giving feedback and speaking on a microphone, so wanted to have a different way that people could participate and use your voice as well. And then we'll come back and we'll have the traditional kind of 3-minute public comment at the end of the meeting. So with that, I will turn it to Jeff Collin. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you, Kathy. It's our pleasure to join you tonight for this very important public process. Part education, a lot of information, and of course we hope to gain information and feedback from the attendees and participants in tonight's meeting as well. As Kathy mentioned, we'll go through a PowerPoint presentation. The purpose of that is to give an overview of federal, state, and local regulations and options, talk about the types of cannabis licenses that are available through the state. Kathy's already highlighted the City Council direction to date, and then explore some local regulatory options as well. You'll see a map posted on the side of the room over there. David Goodison, Planning Director here in Sonoma, will speak briefly about the map and what it displays and why it's important information for you to have as well. So let me just jump right into the PowerPoint presentation. And bear with me, I know many of you probably know more about cannabis than I do, but we're going to start out with some basics, kind of a Cannabis 101. Just in case there's somebody here who's not familiar with the product or the industry and some of its properties. So there's both dried flowers and leaves from the plant. The psychoactive element of those plants, flowers and leaves, is THC. And over the past many years, growers have designed or hybrid the plant so that it emphasizes the amount of THC in it in some cases, so it's stronger on the psychoactive element of it. And in other cases, they've grown the plant and hybrid it to reduce the amount of THC and highlight CBDs. And cannabinoid oil is the non-psychoactive part of the plant that has some medical properties associated. Anti-anxiety, pain relief are a couple of examples of those. Many different products are produced from the plant itself, and that extraction process or the manufacturing process produces things like hash, oil, wax, shatter, and then a whole host of products that are made from those. Infusions, candies, drinks, chocolate bars, cooking sauces, tinctures for under your tongue, oils for your skin, chapstick for your lips, even products for your pets to help with their anxiety and ailments as well. Some of the typical medical uses for cannabis I've listed there. I'm not going to go into them in a whole lot of detail, but very important to many members of the community for medical use. Having said all that, our federal government still classifies cannabis as a federal Schedule I drug. It's illegal on the federal level, and that causes some friction or disagreement with states who've had initiatives or legislative actions to legalize either medical or medical and adult recreational use. Some of the reasoning for why the federal government has kept that status are listed on this slide, and those are for your information as well. And we've tried to go kind of a point counterpoint to some of the federal rationale. They're listed on the slide. Kathy mentioned Prop 64. That was the initiative that legalized adult recreational use of cannabis. And it's important for all of us to recognize the statewide approval measure for that was at about 57%. The county of Sonoma approval rate was 59%. And here in the city of Sonoma, it was 62.4%, so a little higher than both the state and the county-wide approval rate. What did it do? It legalized adult non-medical use of cannabis, but it didn't change the authorities of local governments to regulate or decide whether they were going to permit the sale, manufacturing, testing, or delivery of cannabis within their jurisdiction. Those rules took place on January 1 of this year when the state began operating under interim regulations and issuing state permits. There was this piece of state legislation, SB 94, that brought together the medical and the adult use regulations and tried to eliminate the discrepancies between those two. That law and those interim regulations have some restrictions on where and who can smoke or consume cannabis. It allows for processing cannabis for personal use and growing and giving away cannabis for personal use. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. With every state action, there's a whole bunch of regulations, and that's certainly the case for the cannabis industry. And on this slide are listed the agencies at the state level that have some piece in the cannabis regulation process. The Bureau of Cannabis Control is the overarching state agency that guides that process. The California Department of Food and Agriculture deals with the cultivators and the track and trace system. The Department of Public Health focuses on manufacturers. Why? Because that's where food products are made and medical products are made in many cases. And then the newly renamed California Department of Tax and Fee Administration deals with the excise tax that was part of Prop 64 and the collection of sales and use taxes. And then we've also listed the city of Sonoma because if the city decides to move forward with some portion of the industry, they too will be adopting regulations and have the ability to adopt fees or taxes on the industry. Okay, with that state regulatory process, there's a whole bunch of license categories. And with those categories come descriptions on the types of uses, the type of light that can be used for cultivation, the size of the area, and then listed below that are the fee amount that will be charged for that particular type of license. And here are the ones for the manufacturing, testing, laboratories, distributors, and et cetera. And we've just given ranges. We have more detailed information that give the specific license category, dollar amount, or square footage, and the specific fee at the state level if you'd like to have that. Some of the key state regulations. On the cultivation side, they're going to require bar-coded or metric tags and tracking. That's part of that track and trace system, so they can know how many plants are being cultivated and what goes out for testing and comes back, and track it all the way through the distribution to the point of sale. On the manufacturing side, they're going to have limits on THC. They're going to require that packages be marked in 10 milligram increments so that a consumer knows exactly how much THC they're consuming when they use or consume a product. And there'll be regulations on how to deal with waste that's produced in the manufacturing process. Any product that's going to be sold needs to be tested. Why? They want to make sure that it's safe for human consumption, that it's free of foreign materials, pesticides, that it's mixed in a homogeneous way throughout the product, so there's not more concentration in one part of the chocolate bar than another part of the chocolate bar. And they want to make sure that they know how much THC and how much cannabidiol is in a particular product. There's lots of regulations on transportation. They're going to require alarm systems, a shipping manifest, and only employees of the transportation or distribution system within the vehicle. Distributors transport, arrange lab testing, and do quality assurance. And also important to know is they're the party that's going to be responsible for collection of the state excise taxes. Retailers, they sell and they can deliver the goods. The hours of operation are restricted by the state and can be further restricted by local jurisdictions. There's packaging requirements for the products as they leave the point of sale. They must be in opaque packaging. Deliveries can only be made to a physical address, and no more than $3,000 worth of goods can be delivered, and they cannot package or label goods as cannabis products as they leave the point of sale. So this is a flow chart that just shows some of the activities and the notification process that occurs when state licensing takes place. There are requirements for permittees to show that they have landowner approval for a cannabis activity to take place. So if you're leasing a building or you're leasing your own personal residence, you must get the landowner's permission. A licensee has to have a $5,000 surety bond. All licensees must enter supply chain events into the track and trace system. So you'll be part of that overall statewide tracking system. And when a license is issued by the state, they notify the local jurisdiction. If there's no response within 60 days from the local jurisdiction, the Bureau presumes that there is compliance with local regulations. If there's a response after 60 days that it's not compliant, then they will commence notification and efforts to gain compliance at that point. So medicinal versus adult use. Those are going to be designated in the regulations. Medicinal under an M category, adult use under an A license in the closed systems. And beginning in July of 2018, they gave this 6-month grace period. A licensees can only conduct business with A licensees, and so that supply chain will be all the way through the product as well as on the medicinal side. The only exception is for testing laboratories. They will test both adult and medicinal products. On the medicinal side, you can sell to purchasers 18 years or older that possess a valid doctor's recommendation or California medical identification card. On the adult use side, you have to produce identification that shows you are 21 years or older. So let's talk a little bit about the authority of local government. Other than the use, than personal consumption, the city has the authority to prohibit medicinal or recreational adult use cannabis businesses. They can determine the location of a business and any kind of zoning requirements that may be appropriate for that jurisdiction. They can determine the type of license or permit. They can require a use permit, and they can also adopt or require a special annual cannabis license. On the taxation side, local jurisdictions and the state will collect the sales and use tax. That's that regular statewide sales tax that we're all familiar with. A retail and cultivation tax, they can get one of those approved by the voters. They can also adopt a gross receipts tax. And then they also, like any other land use activity or city government function, can have administrative fees to cover the costs of administering those permits, supervising them, conducting audits, and the like. We talked a little bit about the license categories. This slide shows them in more detail. I won't go into that in a lot of detail or spend much time on it. Again, we have some handouts if you're interested in more detail. And then here, highlighted in yellow, are the license categories that, as your city manager mentioned, the city council has given direction that they're most interested in getting public feedback on and exploring further. And so those are manufacturing using no solvents or volatile solvents, the testing category, and then the retailer for medicinal cannabis products. So what's allowed in Sonoma right now? Where are we today? Right now there's a moratorium on all cannabis licenses other than for personal use and licensed delivery to the city. Where can consumption take place? Smoking cannabis in a private residence or at a business license for on-site cannabis consumption. Right now, there's no business license for on-site consumption in the city of Sonoma. I think the closest one is in San Francisco, if you're looking for an example of what those might look like. An individual can possess up to 28.5 grams or about an ounce of leaf or flower and 8 grams of concentrate. And where can plants be grown for personal use and how much? Growing up to 6 living plants and keeping the cannabis produced within a private residence or an outside greenhouse or a screened area that is not visible from the public right-of-way. Okay, we've mentioned city council direction. Here are those categories again: the medicinal dispensary, manufacturer, testing lab, and delivery for medicinal only. And for those of you who are not as familiar with what some of these things look like out there, we've got some pictures of the various categories. And so here's some photos of some dispensaries in the area. And typically these are located in retail or commercial areas, sometimes in light industrial parks. They have a storefront. Sometimes they have signage on the outside. Usually that does not indicate that it's a cannabis dispensary or that cannabis products are for sale. It just may have the name of the business or the dispensary or adult sales location there. When you enter the area, there's usually a reception area, and at that point you're asked to produce identification, either to prove that you're 21 years or older, or to show that you have a doctor's prescription or a state or county issued medical cannabis patient card. Once you're determined to be eligible to enter the establishment, either as a medical patient or an adult recreational user, you're usually they allow a few at a time into a sales or display area, and that's indicated in this case where the counters and cash registers are there, and the person talking to a particular client there. The products are usually behind glass counters, locked. Sometimes there are video screens behind those that may highlight a particular product. And there are salespeople there who can assist you in understanding the benefits or properties of a particular product, its use and so forth, and help you, guide you through the process in the selection of the materials that you wish to purchase. There'll be a point of sale system that records the transaction, either as an adult use sale or a medical sale. Again, it has to be packaged in an opaque container as you leave the dispensary. So delivery. Delivery, it means the commercial transfer of cannabis or cannabis products to a customer. And so delivery right now in Sonoma occurs from outside the city into this jurisdiction. And most jurisdictions require that occur in an unsigned vehicle. So it can't have advertising on the outside or indication that it's transporting cannabis. And only licensed operators may deliver. And that delivery has to be to a physical address so that they know where that customer is. It can't be to a post office box or something like that. Manufacturing. Manufacturing can occur in as small a space as a few hundred square feet and up to mega processing facilities that are hundreds of thousands of square feet. You may see almost laboratory type environment there that you might see where you are producing pharmaceutical products. There can be on-site testing involved. You also see types of food processing facilities there where they're making chocolate candies, cookies, cakes, drinks, sauces, those kinds of things. And then they'll make oils and tinctures as well, and vapor cartridges. And so here's some examples of the type of equipment that you'll see for the extraction process. You see a pill coating machine, a vapor cartridge, et cetera. And these facilities are usually located in industrial or light industrial type of zoning categories within communities.
Jeff, before you leave manufacturing, can you speak to the difference between volatile and non-volatile?
Sure. So the most common non-volatile extraction method is using CO2. And so it doesn't have any explosive or flammable characteristics with it. On the volatile side, things like butane are commonly used that do have flammable or volatile characteristics. And those are the primary differences that you'll see. On the testing side, this is in a laboratory environment. You'll see small samples brought by a distributor to a lab location. Those samples are tested then to determine what the THC levels are, the CBD levels or cannabis levels, and also to determine where there are any contaminants, things like pesticides, fertilizers, metals, et cetera. And there are very, very strict standards that the state has adopted for those. Those types of facilities are commonly located in business parks, office buildings, sometimes even in a medical office building type of environment. So I've mentioned that cities have regulatory options that they can pursue in this process. And we'll have discussion in more detail at the second town hall following the input that we get tonight on those. But Some of the things under the control and discretion of cities are siting locations, zoning and distance requirements. State law has a 600-foot buffer zone recommendation for K-12 schools, daycare centers, and youth centers. Cities can make those buffer zones larger, and in some cases, there are cities who adopted their regulations early on in the process that have lower or shorter distance requirements, and you'll see those commonly in some of the surveys that we've done for surrounding jurisdiction regulations. The City Council will need to determine what a youth center is, because that's not defined in the law. I've mentioned earlier the ability of local governments to go to the voters to adopt taxes and to collect administrative or processing or permitting fees. That tax election would need to occur when the City Council election normally occurs. I think the next one is in November. Okay. So here's a look at what's happening in some of those other North Bay communities. So the first one is Cotati. Dispensaries are permitted there. In Santa Rosa, Sebastopol, Cloverdale, and Petaluma, not only are dispensaries permitted, but other types of cannabis businesses. And then on the right-hand side of the slide there are the cities that still have moratoriums or bans. And there are some exceptions to what those bans will allow, and those are listed in the parentheses. So I mentioned these dispensary distance requirements. So let me, since this one's kind of small here, let me see if I can pick out some of the distance requirements. Cotati has a 500-foot buffer zone around youth-oriented facilities, schools, and no smoke shop or dispensary can be located in a residential area. Napa has a 1,000-foot buffer zone of any youth-oriented property. And then it has some specific requirements on locations and where they can be located on streets and residential zoning districts. Santa Rosa has a 600-foot radius requirement and a separation requirement between, two dispensaries or businesses that can't be any closer than that 600 feet. And that also applies to the K-12 schools as defined under the state health and safety code. Sebastopol, it's a 500-foot radius, and the locations have to have good visibility to the entrance, and it's only allowed in commercial and industrial areas, not in residential or mobile home park land uses unless there's an intervening non-residential use appropriately separated from the residences. This next slide shows the draft map that shows what facilities would be covered by those buffer zone or radius requirements. It's probably a little bit hard to see there, so we have a wall-mounted copy of it, and we also have printed copies if you want to take one home with you this evening. And so that shows the commercially zoned properties, mixed use. Schools are in blue, parks are in green, and then the buffer zones are in blue dashed areas around the blue and green zoned areas. So actually around the blue areas right now. So one of the interesting things about this industry is in some communities, it also has the ability to generate requests for special events. And we think that may be the case here in Sonoma because of the valuable brand and identity that Sonoma has already. It may be of interest to the industry to sponsor tasting festivals or even cannabis tours, not only of Sonoma, but of some of the surrounding areas. And there's a question, is that a good thing for the community? Is it a good thing for the industry? What would be the impact on the tourism that the community already enjoys from the wine industry and retail and visitor base that it has now? And what's the potential to enhance food, wine, and tourism? because we'd want to make sure that that was the case, not to take away from it. With cannabis, there are also risk factors. As I mentioned earlier, this is a Class 1 substance at the federal level. The future of federal enforcement is unclear. We have a new Attorney General who said he plans to enforce the federal regulations, and then he handed that off to regional prosecutors. And we haven't heard what our federal prosecutor is going to do or what their position will be on cannabis. There's also lobbying efforts to minimize cannabis-specific taxes. In fact, state legislation has been introduced to reduce the 15% excise tax and to eliminate for a 3-year period the cultivation taxes. Because of that federal status, banking is difficult for the industry to get. In many cases, it's kind of a don't ask, don't tell kind of policy. You go in and say, I've got ABC company and I'd like to open a bank account. That's one way of doing it. We don't recommend it, but it's one way of doing it. And there are also emerging cashless systems that we think probably will be the future of the industry, where you purchase in advance a debit card or use a Bitcoin-like internet-based financial system to track your transactions and purchases through the internet. There also is continued impact from the black market. Just because we've legalized the product doesn't mean that the black market or the non-licensed market is going to go away. And so there's going to be a need for continued enforcement of the non-permitted or black market cannabis economy. And because of that, there's some economic instability or uncertainty in the commercial market because of the federal enforcement, because of the black market. And there are questions about the long-term public health and safety issues, things like driving under the influence, cannabis use disorder questions, and questions about the long-term impacts on the development of childhood and adolescent brains. And there's also concern about, do local jurisdictions have adequate and available internal resources, or are they going to need to go outside of the city to bring those in to adequately regulate and monitor the industry? So what do businesses and community groups have to say, or what do they want out of a licensing permitting system and the cannabis industry? From the business owner's perspective, you want to have a profitable business. That's why you usually go into business. Although on the medicinal side, there's also a very strong orientation to provide product to patients. You want to be protected from black market competition. Why? Because you're paying for the permits, you're paying the taxes, you're conforming to the laws, and it feels unfair if you have to compete with somebody who doesn't have to do those things. You generally want low taxes, you want low crime, you don't want to be subject to robberies or break-ins. You want fair and transparent scoring in any kind of a selection or permitting process. You want a simple, streamlined licensing process. You need and want a dependable, trained workforce. And you want security for your employees and your property. And you want to be a good neighbor. You want to operate in harmony with the businesses around you, the residents of the community. And you want legal standing. You don't want to be subject to local, state, or federal enforcement actions. And you want the ability to bank. If you're a community member or a community leader, you want to protect the public health and safety. You oftentimes want to make sure there's access to medical cannabis for medical patients. You want to make sure that there are available education and prevention programs, particularly focused on youth, so that there are limits on the ability of youth to use cannabis products until they're of the appropriate age. You want to maintain the community character, and in some communities, something called equity is important. What is equity? That's fairness in the licensing and permitting process. This came about because of the focus on drug enforcement, often overly impacted minority and low-income communities. And now those communities have decided to legalize cannabis, and there's concern about the expense of the permitting system. And those very people who were overly enforced or subject to enforcement under the prior regulations now, in some cases, don't have the financial resources to apply for a legal business permit in the cannabis industry. And so there are programs that have lotteries and some kind of financial assistance to help them make sure that there's equity in that process. Personal liberty, freedom from arrest, minimal nuisances and smells, and that's that good neighbor aspect, making sure that you're not permitting a nuisance in the community. Many communities want limitations on advertising on the exterior of buildings. They don't want billboards up in the community. They don't want flyers stuck on windshields, those kinds of things. And they want input on where that retail presence can take place in a community. Many communities feel it's not appropriate every place, and so they'll be pretty prescriptive in where retail or point of sale can take place. So that's a quick run-through of the slideshow. What's next is we want to pause here and take any questions that you may have on the presentation we've made so far, and hopefully I can have answers, or Fran or Kathy or David. And David, I don't know if you want to spend a little bit of time talking about the map at this point. I forgot to have you come up here when I ran through the map. I can go back to it if you'd like. Whoop. There you go.
Now, one thing just to re-emphasize, because you've already heard a lot about this in the presentation so far, is that there are many, many state regulations that are in place today on all of these different kinds of commercial cannabis activities that could potentially be allowed within Sonoma. So those run the gamut from limitations on concentrations within certain products, packaging, security requirements, hours of operation for delivery services. So in many respects, a community doesn't need to reinvent the wheel in those different areas. But there are many local questions that do need to be addressed when a jurisdiction does choose to allow commercial cannabis activities within its jurisdiction. And that really brings us to the first question, is which type of commercial cannabis activities, if any, should be allowed in Sonoma? And so that is a local decision. It's a zoning decision. It's going to be made by the city council. And these workshops are part of the council's efforts to gather community input that will help inform them in making that decision. So once that basic question has been answered, if there are activities that the community is comfortable with, then we need to look at what happens at the local level in terms of regulating these different activities. And again, just to reemphasize, the focus that has been developed so far by the City Council has to do with dispensaries, testing, and manufacturing. And just given the types of zoning districts that are available in Sonoma, it would likely be non-volatile manufacturing because we don't really have any land that is zoned industrial. And now to move to this map is intended to highlight the areas that have a commercial zoning designation, which are in red, mixed-use zoning designation, which is purple, schools are identified in blue, and parks are identified in green. So we're talking about commercial cannabis activities. Those can really only be allowed in the commercial zoning designations that the city has, and potentially in the mixed-use zone. So that is a basic question. Which zoning districts should these activities, commercial cannabis activities, be allowed in? Another question just has to do with buffer zones. There is a state requirement that such activities cannot be located within 600 feet of a school. And so we've identified in blue the buffer zones associated with that rule. There's also a limitation on locating commercial activities within 600 feet of a youth center. And let me actually go back to my paperwork here. Under the definition that I believe is applicable, a youth center means any public or private facility that is primarily used to host recreational or social activities for minors, including but not limited to private youth membership organizations or clubs, social service teenage club facilities, video arcades, or similar amusement park facilities. So just as potential examples of that, we've highlighted the Boys and Girls Club in Maxwell Park, the Teen Center in the Maxwell Village Shopping Center, and the library. The library is arguable as a youth center because it may not be primarily intended for youth. It's available to people of all ages. But again, that gets to just a question of what the local decision is in terms of buffer zones. So again, the state mandate is pretty clear with respect to schools. Other jurisdictions have imposed buffer zones relating to other kinds of activities, in particular separation requirements from residential zoning districts or from residences. In Sonoma, that might be somewhat difficult because Sonoma is predominantly residential in terms of its zoning and has relatively limited commercial land use area. So a residential buffer requirement would have to be looked at pretty carefully if there was interest in allowing a commercial cannabis activity in terms of whether or not such a buffer would preclude that altogether. Another local issue that would need to be addressed moving forward if commercial cannabis activities are allowed would be the permit type. A typical kind of permit that we have in place today when we are looking at something in terms of compatibility and issues that might need to be addressed differently than the norm is a use permit. But the downside of the use permit process is that a use permit runs with the land. It is not dependent on, it remains in place regardless of changes in ownership, and it's difficult to revoke if problems arise. So many communities have taken a different approach to require basically a dispensary permit for dispensaries that is specific to the operator, and that is a way of providing more local control to the extent that there is concern about making sure that the operator is operating the use responsibly. And then a fourth issue is that of the number of dispensaries that might be allowed within Sonoma if, again, dispensaries are found to be an acceptable use within the community. Just as an example, Sebastopol has a limit of 2 dispensaries. So if you have this numerical limit, then you also have to decide by what process are you going to choose a dispensary provider or operator if there are competing applications for dispensaries. So those are kind of the broad regulatory issues that we need to be thinking about in this process. And it's not our intention to get very deeply into those details tonight, but based on the feedback that we get in this first workshop, that will help us come up with different kinds of examples and discussion points that we can get into further at the second workshop. So we certainly have a lot of other communities that we can learn from, again, in terms of how such uses are regulated, including Sebastopol, Cotati, and Santa Rosa, to name some nearby communities. But it doesn't leave us off the hook. There are definitely local issues and local decisions that will need to be made if these uses move forward. So that's all I've got for now.
David, before you leave, can you speak to daycares? Because this map does not show daycare right now.
Thank you. And the separation requirement does apply to daycare centers. And for purposes of this slide, we haven't yet mapped those out. Now, typically, those are uses that occur in residential areas, so it may not be that a separation requirement will end up being that meaningful, but we do have to map them out, and we're going to do that before the second workshop.
Thanks, David. So at this point, we're entertaining any questions you may have on the information so far, either the slide presentation or David's comments. Yes, ma'am. Oh, if you could come up to the microphone, please. Sorry.
I just wanted to, if I missed it, will this entire PowerPoint presentation be made available to the public? Yes. And where will we be able to find that?
We will be posting it on our key initiatives page on the city's website, and it'll also, we'll add it to, on our civic web portal, to the council agenda, so it'll be added there. If anyone wants a copy, feel free to email and we'll distribute it out that way. For folks that are in the audience too, this is being broadcast live on our local community television show, and obviously recorded and will be shown again there as well. So, but from the city's website, you can also go back and watch the video as well at your convenience.
Yes, please.
I have a general question, and that is, did the designation adult recreation, is that like from the state level, or is that just something that's been kind of come to designate non-medical use? Because to me, the fact that recreation is attached to that freedom, in effect, gives it the wrong, gives it a total impression that that's all that it's used for, whereas actually it's not. I mean, you can go to a drugstore and buy all kinds of synthetic, over-the-counter things used medicinally and be free and independent to self-administer them. So I was just curious as to how that term came about.
Some of that came from the Prop 64 language. That's the adult use language.
It was in the prop,
And
was
then
it? I don't recall.
It's, I think you're absolutely correct. There are a lot of different reasons why people use cannabis products.
Absolutely.
Some of those
especially
are
the aged.
recreational in nature. Some of those are more on the medicinal side.
Yes, yes. Well, thank you.
Yeah, if I just may add, I've spent a lot of my time on the legislative side of this issue. So the adult term is what you'll see in most of the state implementing language, but it is very, then the recreational becomes more of a broad term that's not necessarily listed in most of the legislative pieces, but you make a really good point. But adult use was really specified to separate it from medicinal, which was allowed prior, to the recreational laws being passed.
I see from your report that you gathered on the county and all the different cities that Sonoma County, Sebastopol, Cloverdale, Santa Rosa, Napa, and Calistoga have provisions for outdoor grows. I thought that the council decided that we would revisit the possibility of doing outdoor grows, at least a portion of the 6 plants. Didn't that happen last council, that you were going to revisit that? Oh, I'm sorry.
Well, I'll give that one a shot. Right now, the moratorium that it's in place with respect to personal cultivation does prohibit outdoor cultivation. In Sonoma, personal cultivation is currently limited under the moratorium to a residence or a fully enclosed structure. The council did direct staff to prepare for lack of a better term, a permanent ordinance that will replace that element of the moratorium. Right now, that draft ordinance, which has recently been reviewed by the Planning Commission, simply follows the moratorium language. But when this goes to the City Council, which it is scheduled to do, I believe next month, the council can revisit that issue, if they choose.
I would appreciate that. Doing indoor cultivation requires equipment that the sun doesn't need, and it's much more likely that people will be able to grow if they can grow outdoors. Thank you.
Okay, if there's no further questions, I think at this point, got another one? Please come on up.
Yeah, and just as a reminder, so please, Chris, welcome. We'll have folks ask questions, and then we'll do the exercise, and then we'll come back for comments as well, and if there's any other questions. I also just want to say sometimes folks are shyer, so where folks are doing the exercise, if you just want to hand a question because you don't want to stand up, feel free to do that, and we'll make sure your question gets answered after the exercise. Thank you.
Thank you. So I grew up here in a young man was here in Northern California. Cannabis is everywhere here. And myself and everybody that I know voted for this to kind of tease this out of the shadows. Many of our friends and family have been involved with the business many times for generations and throughout the northern coast of California. So my concern is a lot of these regulations from the state level all the way down through the county are really kind of suppressing that and keeping it in the shadows. And, I know that everybody's hurting to get some revenue from this, but, maybe a good approach is to take a soft touch, encourage this business out of the shadows, and then as we see what is there to regulate, then start regulating it. Otherwise, it's just going to keep it in the shadows. The businesses are well established. Again, they're established for generations in many cases. The lines of supply, the customers, they're all well established. And all of these taxes, all of these regulations are just further strengthening those current ties. So I think anything we can do to encourage legal business rather than suppress it would be good. Thank you.
Question time. This is question time. We'll have the public comment period following the voting exercise for that. Come on up.
I'll go up there, but my voice pretty well.
We wanted to be able to have the audience at home hear it. We can repeat the question though. Thank you.
All right.
Here, feel free to use this.
Oh,
That's all right. I know. Just that way everyone can hear you.
geez, this is public speaking now. You're all public. The question I have is, if the city says that we can go ahead and grow 6 plants, I would like to know, what kind of poundage are we allowed to grow with the 6 plants? Can you answer that?
That depends on your gardening skills.
Yeah.
But what's legal? Or what's illegal?
So right now, the restriction is on just the number of plants. And so I think David, someone had just said it depends on your gardening skills, but there's some truth to that. Yes, sir.
I'm not that tall. Just a general question. You've done a lot of research, and I applaud that, and it's very detailed. And again, kudos. The question I have is, in looking at the other communities that already have dispensaries and have had them for a long time, there's also data from the agencies that support those communities, police, fire, youth services, etc. Will you be looking into those, say, Santa Rosa, where a patient group has been for over a decade, and others, to see if those communities, with the regulations that you clearly identified, have had an increase, a stabilization, or a decrease in DUIs, in youth break-ins or whatever, in issues related to drug capture, in things where the police have said we've actually had a reduction in youth-oriented drug crimes, or whatever it is. But in those specific areas, your first responders, the support agencies that all communities rely on to maintain the social order, will you be looking at data, hard data that you can share with us in determining how to proceed, because there are a lot of things that I would call under the fear factor because they're unknown, because they've never occurred in this community. But they've certainly been around in many others, and I would hope that you would look into and address and share those. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you. And so we have not been asked by the city to do that research yet. I will say that there is potentially some difficulty in collecting the data. Some agencies do not track some of those crime categories separately. But if that's a desire of the city and the city council to get more information along those lines, we could, explore doing so.
Just if I may, please, if I can just add in, we do have staff on our board. A lot of our company staff are former public health officials, statisticians. So we have a pretty deep bench of people that their job is to look at this going forward. So much of this is new. We have to start collecting data now that it's legal, to your point about DUIs. So we'll be tracking this, not just in the community, but across the state, because I think it's important as best we can. To Jeff's point, the data will be hard to collect, but I think it's really essential to try to get a running history if we can.
Well, that was kind of my question, is if it hasn't been legal in the past, how do you have the information that he would like you to weigh in on, to consider?
So right now, we can collect some data from Washington, Colorado, Oregon, who've had legalization for a longer period of time, and as part of that have started tracking their DUIs differently and separating out driving under the influence of a drug versus driving under the influence of alcohol and so forth. So there are some data sources out there. I just want to caution you that the ability to go to Sebastopol or Cotati or Santa Rosa and get city-specific data, I think is going to be challenging.
I didn't bring my glasses. If you could bring up the map and just tell me where Sonoma Plaza is on that map, and then I can figure out where I'm at.
David, I'm going to let you handle this one.
All right.
Follow that line.
If they could put a pointer up there. And we're right here.
Yeah, we're right there.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Are we ready for the voting exercise? I think so. Okay, so let me explain this to you just for a couple of minutes here. So over on the wall over here, you see a display. It says cannabis business categories. And those represent the 4 categories that the City Council has indicated they're interested in getting public feedback on and may consider moving forward with in the City of Sonoma. And so what we'd like you to do, we'll take about a 15-minute break, is we have yellow Post-it notes for residents. We have blue Post-it notes for non-residents. We'll give you 4 of those Post-it notes so that you can record your vote under manufacturing, testing, dispensaries, and delivery only. And you're also able to write on those Post-it notes. So if you say, I'm in support of a manufacturing business in Sonoma, but only if it's less than 1,000 square feet in size, write that on the Post-it note. If you're in favor of a dispensary, but it only should be open, from 8 to 5 or whatever the restriction is, write it on the note. Got the idea? Yes, ma'am. Blue.
Blue, but it doesn't ask for what distance. In other words, you could be anywhere?
Anywhere.
Just around the city?
Anywhere. You're just not a resident of the City of Sonoma. Yeah.
Just, I think
Doesn't matter.
maybe, I think let me just add, I think this is a good question. So again, Sonoma and the Valley being kind of unique. So why don't we do this? If you don't live in the city limits, then put just Sonoma Valley. If you're from Santa Rosa or Sacramento, then, but it would be good to know city limits, the Valley, because that's kind of our broader community. And then if you're outside that, if you want to be specific or just say outside the Valley, then at least we'll get a sense of where folks are from. Okay. Any other questions on how this could, we have one other, let's also talk about the map though too before, but let's get questions on this first piece first.
Did you say there are going to be 4 posted notes, but aren't there 5 categories?
4.
I can't see that.
Yes. They're all medicinal.
So the categories here, they're all medicinal. It's manufacturing.
The first one is non-category.
Yeah, so sorry, medicinal. Manufacturing, testing, dispensaries, delivery only. And then we're asking for feedback, strongly oppose, neutral, support, strongly support. And then the other thought we thought we'd get some input on, again, the next meeting, we're going to spend a lot more time talking about regulations and the zoning and distance requirements. But before we come back with more of these refined maps, we wanted to get some general input. So again, you can take any color, same kind of color if you would. So if you're a resident and maybe you say 1,000 feet, or you've got other ideas, or allow around the plaza, don't allow around the plaza, those types of things. This is just general input. This isn't, but it would be helpful to get people's perspectives on, because this is a piece, this is land use, this is a piece that the council will have to be determined.
I have a question about the delivery only thing, because if you vote for the delivery only, does that mean you don't want these other 3? Or because in my particular case, I'd be for all of those things, including delivery. In other words, I'd want a dispensary that could deliver.
Yeah, so I think on that, and Jeff, pipe up if we're wrong, but basically if I was voting, which I won't be, I would be putting a card on this row, on this row, on this row, and this row. So each of you are going to have 4 stickies to put up. Is that helpful? There's four categories. We're saying this is medicinal because that's what council said they're interested in is medicinal. So these are the 4 areas. There are some communities that have decided to allow, delivery only for dispensaries, and not allowing the physical dispensary, which is why that is segmented out.
So if you want to make sure that a local dispensary can deliver as well, just write that on your card.
And we would suppose that under manufacturing, for example, there would be reasonable rules eventually adopted as to where and so forth.
Any other questions on, yes, sir?
Am I correct to understand that none of the considerations by the council is for adult use?
At this point, the council has not asked us to explore adult use. So again, that could be, if you want to write, 1, when we have public comment, that is a place to say that. 2, if you want to just add a note up here that you'd like to explore adult use, add that note too. But these were the parameters that staff was given. Yes?
We can define medicinal a little deeper because on the slideshow it actually had doctor's recommendation or a state card. My understanding is under new regs, only the state card is applicable for medicinal.
Okay, I'll let you say that again just in
Sure.
case.
So can we define medicinal a little more clearly? In the slide, we had both a doctor's recommendation and a state card. My understanding is under the current regulations in 2018, only the state medical card is applicable for medical exemption and taxes and medical purchases.
You're correct in that you need a state card to be exempt from the tax. I don't believe that you need a state card to qualify as a patient.
You need the doctor's recommendation, and you need to be voted vital statistics and get your card for the tax.
Correct. So there's a 2-step process, is what I would tell you. And last time I checked, less than 10% of medical patients have gotten the state card. And so the vast majority of medical patients are still being charged the state tax.
Okay, so let's take about a 10, 15-minute break. The other piece, when we come back, we'll do public comments. We'll do, just like a council meeting, 3-minute limit to let everyone speak that wants to.
stickers going in the very top row of the display. And that really isn't a category. So if you're wanting to vote on manufacturing, place them in the second box there.
Anyone who put any comments in this top row here, okay, I am assuming that they are part of the manufacturing, okay? If it's not, if you put something here and it's not part of the manufacturing, then afterwards, if you'd come move it, okay? But that is my assumption if it's there. Does that make sense to folks? Okay. Okay, and again, this is if you're strongly in supportive of these uses, and these are if you oppose these uses in our community, okay? All right, so we're now going to move to public comment, okay? So the way for folks that haven't come to council meetings, we do put a limit on the time because we want to be fair, and we still have a lot of folks in the room that may want to speak. So I will use my phone to track 3 minutes. And if folks could come up and do the 3 minutes, or we could pass some microphone. I just don't, Bob Taylor, who's taping, I don't know if he can capture folks. That's my concern about that. So let's go ahead and ask, if people want to come up and speak, please come up to the microphone. You can address your neighbors and residents. 3 minutes, and appreciate that.
Okay, this is very hard for me because I don't normally do this, but anyway, I am a native of Sonoma. My name is Darlene Torrey. I used to be Darlene Baldwin's. So what I want to say is all my life I've had spinal stenosis. I've gone through shots and chiropractic and drugs, and I ended up with 2 back surgeries, so now I have 3 vertebrae fused. It helps, but a dear friend of mine told me about John. And going back, I'm a person of a woman of the 60s, but I never, ever touched weed, ever. So this friend of mine told me about John and his CBD, and I thought, what the heck? I'm in pain all the time. I'll try it. I'm telling you, I take one every day, like with my vitamins, and I have quality of life, which I never could before. I would have been, if I didn't take that, I would eventually be in a wheelchair. So it just, it's like a miracle. So I wanted to say that. I think it's a wonderful thing for somebody like me, and there's a lot of others that are worse. I also have a dog who had back surgery, and I have given some of the pet medicine that John has to my dog, and it also helps her, calms her down. So it's both of us in the family. Other thing I want to say, and then I'm done, we all say about shopping local. I think we should keep this local for all of that. Keep it local. And that's it. Thank you.
My name's Tom Hauser. I have a very different approach. I just as well, there is no marijuana ever in Sonoma. I want to say, from a city council point of view, I think it's very important that you consider what manufacturing and testing may entail if you're ever going to go anywhere near that, because that would be a big impact on our limited areas where it could be developed. I'm not in favor of dispensary. If people want to have it delivered, you've got that right now. I don't know what I'm going to say. One of the things as I've gotten older, I've gotten a little more cautious in jumping into things, and I think the city council needs to be very, very careful about what they decide to do, because there are a lot of uncertainties out here in terms of what may be good, what may be bad, and what it may impact our budget with enforcement and this and that and the other thing. So I think further putting it off for a year or two until you really see what's going on around you is probably not a bad idea, because it's available for people if they want it. Thank you.
When the next speaker comes up, just one thing, if we could not applaud and not boo. If you want to agree, just raise your hands, go like this, because honestly, we want the space to be safe for whatever anyone thinks that they feel comfortable coming up. So that's part of who we are as a community, to have a civil discourse. So let's not applause. If you agree, just wave your hands like that. No applauding, no booing. Next person, thank you.
Hi, my name is Walter Prane. I've lived here since 1975. I'm a retired physician. I was an internist here in town for all that time. And over that time, I had many patients who benefited from marijuana. The biggest area in my practice was chronic pain, which, as you probably have read with a lot of this discussion about the opioid crisis, chronic pain, we don't really have good ways of dealing with chronic pain, especially things other than the very mildest levels of it, you know. And I've learned from my patients that they got benefit in chronic pain. The other thing is neurological disorders, certain ones. Some of them aren't common, like multiple sclerosis, say, but sometimes marijuana is the only thing that can relieve a lot of the symptoms that they have, the people that they have with that. And other kinds of neurogenic pain, the lady with the chronic back pain and back surgeries, very typical story, actually. So I actually learned from my patients from it. Slightly embarrassed that I was a chicken most of my life in terms of actually prescribing. I never prescribed it. I never gave anybody a medical use thing because I didn't want to expose myself to trouble from the feds. But I certainly endorsed it if you were using it on their own. And so I want to say I strongly am in favor of having a dispensary. I don't think having one in town means you have to use it. If you're afraid about some aspect of it, you don't have to use it. But the people that are using marijuana, I think they should be able to get it conveniently.
I'm Linda Barr, and I agree with the doctor about all the benefits of using it. I support the use of marijuana for medicinal purposes, but I strongly oppose all of the other things with the exception of delivery. I would like the people that use it here and that need it to be able to have it delivered to them from outside of the city of Sonoma. I think that once you have manufacturing, testing, and dispensaries here in town for medical use, it has opened the door for the adult recreational use. That's what I think we need to be a little bit concerned about because of the costs associated with monitoring all of that. So I'm opposed to everything except delivery of it. Thank you.
My name is Antoinette Curry, and I've spoken to the council about this before. I am extremely upset by the fact that this is even being considered. Our daughter was 2.5 years in a treatment facility. I never used any drug ever in my life. It was a horrible experience for me. Buffer zones are ridiculous. If it's here, the kids will get it. And I mean, they could get it anyway, but why make it easier? And why do we need people to be going around and taking I'm not going to deal with the medical aspect of it. I think there are other ways to deal with pain also. But I see no positive thing for society that this marijuana, which is often reduces people's incentives to do things and to accomplish things. I see no positive reason to have it. And even though the people voted for it, I can't understand it. But anyway, if this were to happen, I might want to move away. It's such a horrible thought to me that this could be coming into our town itself. So I want to, the paper isn't talking about it. The other side needs to be heard. The side that knows that the effects it can have on the young brain and what it can do to a society. And so I think you have to consider both sides of this, and not whether it's good for business. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Phoenix. I'm in support of a local dispensary. I'm in support of somebody local having the dispensary, and all that goes with it. I can tell you a few of my own issues. I had cancer, chemo. It helped tremendously, keeping the chemo to a dull roar. I had a huge ganglion cyst on my wrist. It was about half the size of a golf ball. It cost over $8,000 to have it removed, billed to Medicare. It was back in 2 weeks. I went to another surgeon. He said, that's what happens. I've been taking John Early's medicinal CBD pills for a year, and now it's the size of a pea. $8,000 versus about $150, $120, whatever it was, for 2 little bottles. I take it every day as a supplement. I think it's a medicinal miracle plant, and I strongly recommend that we hurry and get something happening for the people who really need it. And I'm one of them. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Amber Asucci, and I work with the 421 Group. We're a California cannabis consultancy based in Sonoma County here, and we work with cannabis businesses, preparing them to enter and be in the regulated market. So after the citizens of California voted to legalize cannabis recreationally, many cities have been working day and night to enact these regulations and support the new law. We wholeheartedly support legalizing adult use cannabis sales, manufacturing, and distribution. It's a critical part of the supply chain, one which is best served through the regulated market. I've been doing community outreach in Sonoma County and on behalf of cannabis businesses for a year and a half, and getting to know all the local businesses and residents, and the majority of the local community that I've connected with have voiced their support of cannabis regulations and sound policies. So I think adopting a permissive medical and adult use cannabis ordinance in Sonoma is the right thing to do for this city, for the existing cannabis businesses who've served the patients during this regulatory years of collectives, and for the patients and consumers that will be able to shop locally for their cannabis needs. Thanks for your time and all the time spent developing these regulations.
My name is Grace. I don't live in the city. I live just north of here, up towards Agua Caliente Knolls. And I work in a dialysis center where we reopen people's fistulas and grafts so that they can continue living. And a lot of them have been drug abusers of codeine type of medications and alcohol throughout their life. And now they can't do any of that, but they can still smoke marijuana as a drug to alleviate their pain. They are end-stage renal failure patients, so a lot of them don't have more than a couple years left. And I'm one of the people that helps them on their way out with life. And I'm just glad that they have that available to them, because there's nothing much they can really take anymore. Anyway, I think it's great for the city to have something like this for both reasons, for medical patients and for recreational. I think people need to drink less wine after what I've seen with kidney failure patients. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Susan Levine, and I live on Castle Road, so not in the town of Sonoma, but Sonoma County. And I've gotten to know John Early since living here for about 2 years. And I'm a double amputee, as you can tell, and I have chronic phantom pain. And there's very little that works to treat phantom pain, but CBD happens to be something that is sometimes efficacious, and I've been working with John to figure out, is there something that could help me? But clearly, people like me and others who have spoken benefit from from CBD and other cannabis products. So my view is, and I'm a very practical business person, it's legal. Other areas near us have dispensaries and are selling it, and their communities are benefiting from the revenues that come with that. Why shouldn't Sonoma benefit from having a dispensary and the associated taxes, just as it benefits from all the tasting rooms and wineries that are also regulated businesses that, if misused and if used by children, will also have negative impacts, but it's a regulated business. So that's what I have to say. Thank you.
Hi. My name is Melanie King, and I'm a resident of the Springs, so technically I'm a Valley resident, not a city resident, so I don't get to vote on such things. I'll be honest, 421 Group, shout out to you. I work for CannaCraft. We're the largest manufacturer of cannabis products in California. So some of the pictures that you saw up on the screen are where I go to work every day. We have extraction machines. We have a whole manufacturing facility that makes chocolates. We are self-distributing. We have our own cultivation team. So from seed to shelf, we're completely vertically integrated. Gotten to know a lot about the cannabis industry since I've been in it for almost 2 years. Crash course for sure. This is changing and moving really, really quickly, and if Sonoma doesn't safely engage, we're going to miss a lot. So a few things I wanted to talk about and that are super important that I think maybe we can go in more detail in the future. One is safety and why we lab test. Safety is so important. Somebody said, you know, people are going to get it anyway. It's really important that they get it from the right places. We're talking about molds, pesticides, but beyond that, people are getting really dirty medicine, and this can be seen even within the industry. So testing is super important. Having a lab here would be fantastic. It's a tool that we can all use, and there's no risk or safety issues at all. I want to talk about jobs. Cannabis puts food on my table and on the table of 300 of my coworkers every day. I am a single mom, and I need an industry that understands what it's like to work hard. The cannabis industry, I have never worked with anybody as industrious in my life. These guys can figure things out. They are creative. They are survivors. That's how this whole thing came to be. They were resilient, and I'm proud to be part of that community. So I wanted to say, let's not forget about the people like me who do events and education, the people who are graphic designers, the people who work in distribution, drive the trucks. It's not just about the cultivators. It's not just about those extractors. A lot of people work because of cannabis in Sonoma. Lastly, I just wanted to touch a little bit about culture, tourism, and how actually it's a complement. I don't know if a lot of people understand how much cannabis has progressed. This is a luxury item. It works well in a luxury market. So this is not to say that, I often joke that people think that the people in cannabis are just bandolier wearing, gun toting, cash floating out of our pockets, criminals. I'm the face of cannabis. Okay? I like really good wine. I like really good food. And that's why I trust my products to come from a good source. So just a little bit of the other side in the culture of cannabis. Thank you for your time.
So I have just a few things to say. I understand people who are opposed, and I understand their fear, but one important element there is that with the legalization and the ultimate development of controls, as there are for wine and a hard liquor, it takes that off the streets, and children are less susceptible to being drawn to even worse drugs because they're then dealing with people who really don't give a darn about, as long as they sell something. So that's something on the legal side that I think needs to be, or I consider. The other is, you have to be as old as I am, I guess, to have any remembrance of how marijuana or cannabis, which I prefer hearing it called, because words start thoughts off in people's minds. When that campaign against it started, it was all an industrial thing. I do not have the names, but you can go online and you can research it, because hemp, from which cannabis comes, was a product that was very reasonable for producing so many things that were needed in society, but some very powerful men managed to get it as a number one. And those movies, I don't know how many of you saw, but the movies they made of people going nuts on cannabis and raping and God knows what were really propaganda. The other thing I don't hear talked about much is the psychological impact or benefits of it. Now, I, for the last couple of years, have been dealing with the 9th decade of existence. Is that right? Anyway, and I did see one great program. It was a documentary on some of the medical advances being done in Israel, and they showed a hospital, fully assisted care place where they were providing cannabis. And there was a wonderful gentleman in a wheelchair who was getting his daily dose. So the aging of psychology is something that's not been really touched upon very much yet, and everybody keeps up a great front, but let me tell you, the challenges to the mind are great, and a little bit of cannabis can go a long way. Now, I've not been a regular user. I've had it sporadically over the years, but I was exposed to it when my husband, who was a professor, and the stuff came west and all of that. You couldn't go to a party where people weren't smoking it. And, you know, the smoking doesn't need to be done if one doesn't want that. The last thing is there are some really good studies. There was one done, I think, in the 60s or 50s on how useful cannabis is for treating alcoholism. And that was a great study. But again, it was suffocated and all, you know, the stuff.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's the 3 minutes, to be fair. Thank you so much.
Nine decades, we should all be so lucky. So just on a medical dispensary in Sonoma, again, I just want to point out here in Northern California, you know, a medicinal dispensary is really about helping people who can't help themselves. Many of us do have the social networks. We have friends and so on, or whatever it is, and it's not a problem for a lot of us. So really, this is about helping people who really cannot help themselves. You know, many of the people that came up here tonight who are really suffering, that, you know, they don't want, maybe they can't get out of the community, maybe they don't have a ride, or maybe they don't feel like comfortable taking a bus with some weed on them, I don't know. But really having that here in town is the compassionate thing to do. And I really strongly encourage you to have something like that here to help the people in our community who really do need that. Thank you.
Ken Brown, live here in town, strongly endorse a medical facility for Sonoma. Shop local, David. I've heard you say that multiple times. And the citizens here want to shop local as well. And I'm here as well to speak for our dog, Phoebe, a wonderful being on this planet who has helped greatly by medicinal cannabis. Thank you.
I'm Jewel Matheson. I'm a founding member of the oldest dispensary in the city of Santa Rosa. We are now recreational. I want to invite our community, because we do not have safe access here yet, to come and visit us. If you want to take a discount card, please do. And I just want to applaud our city for taking this step. I've been working for safe access for my patients, thousands, tens of thousands in the decade that I've been working in the cannabis industry. I can't tell you how many people have come to me thanking me for being there, for getting the medicine that they weren't able to get, mitigating medical issues that they couldn't get met in the pharmaceutical realm. So I'm just really excited that we're here, that we're moving forward, and it looks like we have a resounding number of people that want to move forward. It's just very encouraging, and I just thank you all for being here and engaging in this process. Thank you.
Good evening. I'm John Early. I've been mentioned a couple times from attendees. I've been in this business since 2009, and I created a product line, seed to sale, the whole gambit. So I understand the industry very well, but more importantly, it's who we've been able to serve. And the most interesting stories are the seniors. And some of my most recent clients have been Alzheimer's and dementia patients in facilities in Santa Rosa through Dr. Grove. And there's a phenomenal positive result with dementia patients and Alzheimer's patients. And my wife, who is going through chemo, she's had several implants and replacements. It's really unfortunate that it's been such a difficult path to get this legalized in this town. And as a result, I've been trying to promote a site that we've acquired at the old community cafe. We'd love to put a dispensary in the back and remodel the restaurants and the annex in the front. We think it's a good location. So Jules promoted her dispensary experience, and I'd like to do the same. So thanks very much.
Okay. Well, then, Jeff, anything else or David, Fran? Okay. So first, thank you all for coming, and I want to thank our city council for being here as well. Appreciate all of you. In terms of our next steps, for those of you, if you came in a different door, when you walk out the main door, if you didn't sign the sign-up sheet, please do so. If we have your email, we'll make sure that you get an email about the next meeting. The next town hall meeting will be April 11th, Wednesday, 6:39, same location. And if you have other questions or anything that you'd like us to maybe look at, you can just email cityhall@sonomacity.org. But thank you all for coming up and providing your voice for our town. Bye-bye.